Hello, my name is Joe and welcome to my channel. After nearly a year and a half of nothing major coming out for RWBY, aside from the Roman holiday book, we have the release of the new RWBY anime, Ice Queendom. So I thought, hey, let's review it. So first off, I'll be giving a spoiler-free review, and then I'll dive more in depth into each of the 3 episodes that were released. For this spoiler-free review, I'll be focusing on 3 aspects: animation, audio, which will include music, voice acting, and sound design, and pacing, though I'll touch on that more in depth in the spoiler review. Animation-wise, I think this show is kind of a mixed bag, honestly. The art style, while not personally my favorite, is fairly distinct and gives off a kind of similar vibe to some of the early RWBY art. Most of the big action scenes are really beautifully animated, and the weapon effects in particular are really cool. The unfortunate flip side of this is that everything else is pretty stiff and uninteresting. This is understandable given animation, especially super high quality stuff like this, is a big time and money sink, so they would want to put more resources into the action scenes of this action anime. This is, as I said, completely understandable, but I can't help but compare it to the original series. Say what you will about Volume 1's animation, because there is a lot to say, but something Monty did really well was defining the characters through their body language. Weiss's movements are aggressive and somewhat holier-than-thou. Nora is hyperactive and uses things like jump cuts to showcase how excitable she is. And Jean switches on a dime between a laid-back and kinda easy confidence, folded in on itself self-consciousness, and an easy-to-spot false bravado. There's a bit of that body language distinction in IQ, but it's much less prominent and makes the characters feel a lot more bland. The audio, by and large, is really good. I think the sound design is alright, though some of the weapon sounds don't hit quite as hard as I'd like them to, but no huge complaints. The voice acting is really solid. I'm especially liking Sayori Hayami's take on RWBY. I don't think all the voices give quite the same feel as the original actors, but I might just need to get used to them. I'm interested in seeing the dub and how the original actors portray the new versions of these characters. I've heard some people complain about the music not being as good as Jeff Williams's, but I'm personally enjoying it. I think it captures a similar enough feel while still adapting to a different medium, so no complaints from me there. The pacing is the biggest issue in the series thus far. What the 3 episodes are adapting has more than double the runtime of these episodes, and boy does it show. RWBY Volume 1 already has pretty fast pacing, and this goes through things so much faster that I feel like people who haven't seen the original will be left pretty confused as to what's happening. This is an especially big hindrance in the 3rd episode, but I'll go into that in my spoiler review. Quick final thoughts before that though. The question is, should you watch this? Personally, I would say yes. If nothing else, because the first 3 episodes are free on the Crunchyroll Collection's YouTube channel, so you can watch them pretty easily and form your own opinions. On the whole, I personally don't think it works super well as either an adaptation or a standalone show, but I've seen a lot of people really enjoy it, and I myself am gonna continue watching just to see where it goes, even if I'm not the hugest fan currently. Now, moving on to the spoiler review. How this is going to work is I'm going to go through each episode individually, and then at the end talk about some of the overall thoughts I had, as well as how I would have fixed some of the issues I had with it. Also, this is going to be including spoilers for both these 3 episodes, and probably the original series as well, just so you're aware. Episode 1 was really solid in my opinion. It covered the black and white trailers, episode 1 of the original series, and added a couple bits and bobs. The animation on both Weiss's fight against the Armagigas and RWBY's fight against Torchwick were gorgeous, and they made me so happy to see animated in this style. I also think all of the little things they added were honest improvements. The inclusion of Weiss's family was a very good idea. especially given this series will likely focus largely on her, and the development of RWBY not actually being a good student at Signal, I honestly really like. Her and Yang also seem even closer in this continuity, which I don't mind one bit. Plus, Whitley in one line here has more depth than in volumes 4 to 7 combined, so that's a thing. It wasn't perfect though. I think that some things could have used better exposition, like what dust actually is and what faunus are. Also, where the hell did Ozpin get those cookies? I also think some of the dialogue is a bit wonky, like keeping Blake silent after saying goodbye to Adam would have been more effective in my opinion, rather than having her say, I need to find my own path, and then in her next scene saying, now I can find my own path. Still, those are overall nitpicks, and I really like this episode. As an adaptation, I'd give it a 9 out of 10, and as a standalone, I would still probably give it a solid 8 out of 10. Episode 2 is where things start to go downhill, however, particularly in the adaptation department. There are definitely things I like with their changes, such as Jean being much less of an asshole in his interactions with Weiss and Pyrrha, and their pretty effective condensing of some early beats of the story. However, I think they skipped over a lot of important beats that I personally feel is a detriment that they didn't include, as well as changing a couple of things that really they didn't need to. Like where the Deathstalker came from, it just randomly appeared with no build-up. Or how the Deathstalker was actually killed. It was a clever plan in the original show because they couldn't pierce its armor, so they used its own tail to pierce it. Now, they cut the tail off to distract it, I guess? Then they just chiseled it, which was super cool, but a lot less clever. Also this. What kind of character assassination are we looking at here? I think my biggest gripe, though, is the removal of Jean and Ruby's first meeting. I'll probably cover this more at the end, but that is, in my opinion, a very important scene and one of my favorite scenes in early RWBY. And it keeps getting skipped over, come on! So yeah, as you can see, Jennifer kinda got shafted. Heh, shaft. I've seen some suggest that this is because the story focuses more on Weiss, but I still don't think that's a good reason. I will say though, they did a good job showcasing how people perked up and started gossiping at Pyrrha's name, which I consider to be an improvement from the original. I also feel like the Nevermore fight and the episode as a whole was less effective at showing both RWBY and Jean as leaders. I still liked it well enough, but definitely a step down. Oh, also, Xion was introduced, and I like them, but their design does not fit RWBY at all. As an adaptation, I'd give it maybe a 7 out of 10, and as a standalone, I'd probably say the same. And finally, Episode 3, aka RWBY Volume 1 Speedrun Any Percent Glitches Allowed. Yeah, this one's pretty rough. That tends to happen when you try to fit half of a volume into a single 20-minute episode, while also introducing the aspect of the series that causes it to split from the main one. The badge and the burden was handled alright, and I can understand cutting Jaundice in its original form given how unpopular it is. Though them rearranging the Aura Awakening scene really makes some big plot holes. But boy oh boy, everything else is not great. Talking about the adaptation aspect first, in their original forms, episodes 15 and 16 of RWBY would have taken up most of this episode's runtime. Now, they're condensed into less than 10 minutes, not even half the episode's runtime. This of course leads to cut content, such as the entirety of the dogs fight, which was the last big fight of Volume 1. But this on its own wouldn't be a problem. The problem comes with what led up to this. We've known these characters, in this continuity at least, for 2 episodes at this point. They've known each other for an episode and a half? We've spent so much less time with them, and them with each other, that both the conflict and the resolution to that conflict have next to no impact compared to the original show. There isn't enough leading up to it. This also comes from an issue of characterization, but I'll discuss that in a bit. The original story elements introduced suffer from the same issue. Jean is possessed by a nightmare Grimm feeding on his doubts and insecurities. His team must enter his dream to save him, allowing the audience to learn about his psyche and history. This subplot is what replaces the original Jaundice arc, and on paper, sounds awesome. This subplot also takes place over less than 5 minutes. This sequence was just really bad. It's a cool setup, and the little tidbits we learn about John are neat, but the entire thing happens and is resolved so quickly that there aren't any stakes to it. Plus, it's super anticlimactic. Seriously, Juniper saves Jean within a minute of finding him, and we don't see any of the fight. And even if it took longer, we have the issue of barely knowing these characters. In total, we've probably gotten like half an episode of screen time with them. Shion explains that they're a good team because of how they care for each other, but prior to this, we haven't seen any of that. And speaking about caring for each other, why is RWBY even there? Meta-wise, it's so they can learn about the Grimm, but what about in canon? Because they're friends, right? But without RWBY and Jean's friendship being the primary binding force and foundation, it doesn't really make as much sense. Or at least not that they're close enough friends to be there for this Grimm problem. The issue with both of these story beats in episode 3 is that they haven't been earned. These parts that in the original either were or would have been important moments of character development now have little to no meaning because they haven't been built to at all. And this is bad from an adaptation angle, but worse from a standalone show angle, because it makes it feel like random things are just happening. They never even said Sun's name in the episode. Who is this guy? Also, they established in the episode that Jean doesn't have much aura, which is a really big change for his character. It doesn't matter that much because I don't think we'll get to the point of unlocking his semblance, but the change didn't sit super well with me. It's just too big of a departure for their canon-adjacent explanation, and it didn't even really makes much sense for what it was justifying, so yeah, really weird plot point. For an adaptation, I'd give it a 5 out of 10, and for a standalone, I'd probably drop it down to 4. Now that I've gone through all 3 episodes, I'm going to discuss a few more general aspects that I noticed. The first of these was the tone of the show. The thing I noticed about the tone being it just wasn't very funny. Humor is of course subjective, but regardless of your opinion on if RWBY is actually funny or not, at the very least, an attempt at humor has been an important aspect in the show's makeup since the beginning. Especially in the beginning, even. There were a few things that made me chuckle, but it's definitely a more serious tone. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing is really up to your preference, though. The decrease in humorous tone can also be attributed to something else, though. That being the vastly different characterization between this show's characters and those of the main series. Now, this isn't always a bad thing. I think that there are some characterizations that I find really interesting. RWBY, for instance, seems a bit more like a kid than her original self. Her original portrayal at times seeming a bit too wise for a 15-year-old, in my opinion. I also think Sun was more charming in this than in the original, and they even made Penny simultaneously cuter and creepier, which I kinda love. Also, side note, they kinda did this with Pyrrha in one scene where she partners with Jean, and there's this ominous music in the background, giving off real yandere vibes, but I don't think it was actually intentional, and that's like one of the weirdly funniest parts of this series. More often than not, though, I do think it's more of a detriment. I mentioned Pyrrha, but from what we've seen so far, I really find her character a lot less endearing than in the original show. She doesn't have that awkward streak that helped to really define her character, and instead comes across as a more generic confident girl who probably likes this one guy. Ren didn't really do a ton in Volume 1, but at least his exasperation with Nora and her antics set a baseline to grow from, and gave him some kind of character, along with making his interactions with Nora stand out more. In this show, he feels like less of a character than Oscar. I think this is mostly an animation thing, because Ren is shown smiling fairly often, which I don't think he actually does very much in the original series. Like even now, I don't think he does it very much. Of all the characters, I think Jean is hit with the most of this characterization, though. This also being due in part to the change in tone. One of the things I really liked about early Jean was that he was a comic relief character who knew he was a comic relief character, but didn't want to be the comic relief character anymore. I don't know why, but I just always love that trope. But because the show is more serious now, Jean can't be treated as much like the universe's punching bag, so that characterization is just thrown out pretty much. They didn't change his internal conflict that much, but they changed how he reacted to it. In the original show, Jean internalized things until they exploded out of him, like when he admitted how he cheated to get into Beacon Tapira. Now, don't get me wrong, excluding this and altering his scene with Weiss and Pyrrha definitely make him less of an asshole, but also less interesting. Plus, with removing his introduction scene with RWBY and changing his fight with the Deathstalker, they also removed the moments of positive characterization that he had. Now the character is more palatable, but also a lot more bland. He still has some interesting stuff with his family, it seems, but I doubt it's going to be covered much more. Weiss, interestingly, suffers from something pretty similar in my opinion. I've seen some people say she is much, and I quote, bitchier in Ice Queendom, and to that I ask, when's the last time you watched Volume 1? Like, Weiss is maybe a bit more manipulative here, deciding to be nice to RWBY to get points instead of trying to improve herself, but her general demeanor is much friendlier. Like, Weiss in Volume 1 was super mean. This one is more haughty, I guess, and spoiled. While this characterization I find pretty interesting, I also think it definitely lessens the impact of her reconciliation with Blake. Not only have we not had any build-up of Fauna stuff, but we haven't had enough of Weiss being awful to be happy about her coming around to Blake. Weiss and Jean are, in the original series, two of the most well-developed characters in the show, and that's because they were so imperfect at the beginning. What do you know, it's almost like the writers made flawed characters so they'd have room to grow. Crazy, So yeah, as you can see, I had a fair few issues with how these 3 episodes, especially the last one, were handled. But I think my complaints can all kind of be boiled down to the pacing issues. And if there had been one more recap episode, everything could have been given more room to breathe and include some of the cut content. So I'm going to outline how I might have spread things out if it was given another episode to do Volume 1. Episode 1 would remain pretty much exactly the same. As I said, I thought it was super solid. The one thing I would probably change is at the end when they show Ruby and Juniper, show them just at the docks, rather than having their characters already on the airship to Beacon. The next episode would start off with Ruby and Yang separating, maybe with Ruby running off in excitement, which seems decently in line with this version of the character. We'd then get the classic scene of Ruby knocking over Weiss's luggage, and Weiss would be able to showcase her more traditional harshness, along with briefly explaining what dust actually is to the viewer. I think Weiss would just leave here instead of Blake coming up, though, because I actually really like how the sisters met up with her and introduced the STC to us in the show. Following Weiss and RWBY meeting, we would have Jean and RWBY meeting, and I'd keep this pretty much the same as in the main show, maybe just a bit shorter to save on time. They would get on the airship, and RWBY would meet back up with Yang. Jean may have gone with her, but he is interrupted by the airship taking off and an immediate need to vomit. The episode would continue as it did originally until the scene in the locker room, where Jean would put on a bit more false bravado like the original and not say that he doesn't like pumpkin peats, come on. Then the intercom would come on and tell the students that their initiation will begin immediately and to prepare their landing strategies. Jean would question what a landing strategy means before the hangar doors would open and all the students would fly out. I felt like this was kind of a missed opportunity in the actual show to just have the real shock of dropping all these students out of the airship instead of launching them. The episode would continue as it had, adding in the aura unlocking scene and a brief moment of Jean and Pyrrha finding the Deathstalker, probably expanding the Yang vs. Ursa fight a bit, and if there's time, including the Ren vs. King Taijitu. Ren would, of course, be more exasperated in this version. Episode 2 would end on a cliffhanger with RWBY and Juniper separated and facing off against their respective enemies as suspenseful music fills the background. Episode 3 would contain the Nevermore and Deathstalker fights, with the Deathstalker being killed in the original way, and continue on to the Badge and Burden storyline, also interspersed with the beginning of Jaundice as it was in the episode. This time, also including a brief scene of Jean seeming to push Pyrrha away. The episode would end with another cliffhanger of Jean's nightmare showing himself and Juniper finding him in the morning with something wrong with his aura. Now that the audience actually knows Jean a bit more, this would have more of an impact. We can also probably include a scene of Velvet maybe being bullied by Cardin like in the original, and use that time to explain what a faunus is. Episode 4 would be essentially just the rest of what Episode 3 was, just expanded thanks to having more time. I think allotting around 7 minutes at the start to resolve Jean's deal and introduce the Nightmare Grim. Couple changes I would make would probably be to, actually show the rescue a bit more. Have Xion instead explain how Jean has a large aura pool, but the lack of training and refinement make it harder for the Nightmare to feed on, and maybe even include RWBY in the people who go into Jean's nightmare. I know they probably just wanted to include the team, but it would be helpful to include one of the title characters as a kind of perspective character when doing it. And, RWBY would have probably interacted with Jean more than Ren or Nora at this point, so it would make sense. The Blake and Weiss storyline would probably be much the same, but Weiss would have been more of her original harsh self here, leading to the payoff being more effective. I would also probably include the beginning of the dogfight, but cut it off as Penny was about to get involved, and then cut back with Roman fleeing like they did in the show. Because I kind of dug the ominous feeling they were going for there. I actually really liked that part. Finally, the episode would end much like the previous one, with a nightmare revealing itself, this time to Weiss. This is largely changing stuff involving Juniper, which I'll admit I tend to prefer over RWBY, but I think in general it would have improved the pacing and impact issues the show faced. I don't know, maybe some of my complaints will feel less apparent in the next few episodes, or maybe the characterizations will feel more like the original in the dub, but I found myself a little disappointed, mainly in the third episode, but decently in the second one as well. But hey, those are just my thoughts. What do you think? Agree? Disagree? Think Ice Queendom is the best thing since sliced bread? Let me know in the comments down below. And subscribe. More RWBY news seems to be coming out soon, so I'll probably be covering that too. Till next time, safe journeys, my friends.